Пятку до колена, видите, до колена.
Ебать! Ебать! Детройт, нас накрили!
Why is the Ukrainian counteroffensive going so badly? And for those who question the veracity of that statement and remained duped by propagandistic statements like this from Ukrainian General Zelensky.
You think you can take Bakhmut?
Yes, of course. I sure.
Remember that these men have no choice but to spread lies to keep the moral high. Even within the Ukrainian administration, the reality of the failing counteroffensive is being admitted. Here's a clip from an interview with Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba.
Extremely densely mined territories. Sometimes our soldiers literally have to crawl 200, 300 meters per day, slowly demining the corridor for our advancing forces, and they do it at the risk of their life. The second obstacle is heavily fortified Russian defensive lines. The third one is the domination of Russia in the air. And our forces suffer a lot because we lack anti-air, anti-helicopter and anti-plane weapons on the ground. That comes at a price of human life.
Even Zelensky's former advisor, Arestovich, is saying that for Ukraine to win, they will need at least 3 counteroffensives with long breaks in between. In America, we still have the Ukraine hawks, who just repeat the scripts of Ukraine going from one victory to another victory, but which is diametrically opposed to the reality. And speaking of realists, here's some sobering and objective analysis from US Professor John Maersheimer.
Look, this counteroffensive was suicidal. And the Ukrainian forces that launched the offensive starting on June 4th, the main units that NATO trained up were clobbered. And in fact, other units were clobbered as well. The Ukrainians didn't stand a chance. I think it was remarkably irresponsible of the West, especially the United States, to push the Ukrainians to launch this offensive. Let me say a bit more about the imbalance between the Ukrainian military on one side and the Russian military on the other. It's not only the fact that the Russians had all these prepared defenses. The fact is that the Ukrainians have a significant disadvantage in terms of artillery, which is the most important weapon on the battlefield. The Russians have probably a 5-to-1, 7-to-1, maybe even 10-to-1 advantage in artillery, which is the king of battle. Furthermore, the Russians control the air. The Russians are allowed to bring air power to bear on the Ukrainian side of the battlefield. So not only are the Russians pounding the Ukrainians with artillery, they're pounding the Ukrainians from the air with all sorts of smart bombs and doing egregious damage to the attacking forces. Furthermore, the Ukrainian forces are not well trained. You can't take a bunch of Ukrainians and train them for a couple months in Germany or Britain and expect them to launch a blitzkrieg like the Germans did in May of 1940. It takes years to produce an army that can do that.
So why is the counteroffensive in Zaporizhia going so badly for Ukraine? Well, Russia had many months to prepare, and Ukraine unwisely decided to put out movie trailers to telegraph the upcoming counteroffensive. Perhaps, just perhaps, this is what happens when you put an actor as a president. Everything becomes a Hollywood movie. But on a more serious note, a very detailed article in New York Times sheds some light on the intricate and impregnable defensive Russia has built. And the article is fittingly entitled 21 Miles of Obstacles. But before we get into it, please remember to hit the subscribe button and help the algorithm boost this channel. And now, without further ado, let's get into it. this article, which was published on the 20th of June 2023, and it starts off with a very informative depiction of what a Ukrainian tank advance will have to face: the multi-layered defenses with minefields, infantry hidden in tree lines, then after trenches, and then they approach the vehicle defense of the Russian army. So this is an example of a defense line near Orikhiv in the Zaporizhia region. It says 3 weeks in, Ukraine has made little progress toward one of its main lines of attack in southern Ukraine. Russia has a crucial ally, the unforgiving terrain of the south. Now, the same terrain we are seeing here in Zaporizhia that's causing Ukraine so much difficulty is similar terrain to what we saw in the fall offensive in Kherson, open steppe territory with little area for the Ukrainian attackers to hide. It was also similar to the terrain in Kharkiv, and this is why I keep reiterating that those fall offensives were more defeats for the Ukrainian army because of the massive casualties they suffered, and you're going to see why when we analyze the article and the terrain in Zaporizhia. And here's what it says: wide open fields leave little room for cover for Ukrainian troops, tanks, and armored vehicles. So we can see it's a lot of open steppe territory with large open fields surrounded by tree lines, and the tree lines offer perfect hiding places for the Russian troops. And it says tree lines, the edges of those fields, concealing Russian forces and shielding them from aerial observation, so the Ukrainian drones cannot work as effectively. Then after the open fields, we see a Russian defense line, and it has anti-tank traps and trenches built in. Beyond natural obstacles, miles of Russian defenses, trenches, tank traps, and mines only allow Ukraine's troops to make incremental progress at best. Then another 5 miles behind the first defense line is another Russian defense line. And it says if Ukraine can get 15 miles from the front line to the city of Tokmak, urban warfare will pose its own challenges. Tall buildings and narrow side streets ensure combat will be at close quarters and deadly. So Ukraine is currently still in the tactical zone. They haven't reached the first Russian defense line, behind which there are 2 further Russian defense lines. And while Ukraine is struggling to capture villages, they have large cities that they have to penetrate and siege before they can get to the Sea of Azov. When you look at this article and you observe the terrain, you realize that Ukraine will never succeed in this counteroffensive. And I believe an article in the Washington Post admitted that at the rate that Ukraine is going, it will take them 16 years to reach the Sea of Azov. So 2 possibilities are here. Either this counteroffensive is a feint, and Ukraine is preserving the larger part of its reserve for a counteroffensive elsewhere, possibly around Bakhmut, where Russia has not had the time to build up these impregnable defenses. Or this is simply a suicidal counteroffensive authored by the American administration using the Ukrainian infantry as a battering ram. And what has been the progress so far? Well, Ukraine has managed to retake several villages, not towns, not cities, villages thus far into the offensive. And let me make it clear, some of these villages have 1 street and no more than 10 to 15 houses. If we lived in an age where there was no internet access, these captures would never have been reported in previous times, because they are so insignificant and minuscule. The article continues, but it is unclear if Ukrainian forces will have enough resources to breach Russian defenses around the larger settlements such as Tokmak. The city had a pre-war population of about 30,000 people. For comparison, look how long it took the Russians to take Bakhmut, which housed about 70,000 people. Mind you, Ukrainian army defended Bakhmut with everything they had. Russia had superior fighting power, superior artillery, and had the positional advantage, and it still took months. How long you think it will take Ukraine to take Tokmak or Melitopol or Mariupol? What army will they have left when they actually reach these cities which are at the 2nd and 3rd defense lines? In short, the best option for Ukraine, in my opinion, is to call off this counteroffensive, reserve their army, take up defensive positions, and induce the Russians to attack. But here's the problem. They cannot afford to do that, because it is not the Ukrainian military who are deciding their operations. It is the United States of America. And as Henry Kissinger so aptly said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal.